Yeah. Okay, good evening, everybody. It's so good to see everyone here and ready to study God's Word. I want to welcome those of you who may be visiting the first time. This is our class on the miracles and parables of Jesus. We have concluded the miracle session, and we're now on the parables section. We have only 6 classes remaining of this trimester. It's going away rapidly. Following tonight, just 5 remaining classes, and one of those is going to be a review session. So we've talked about several different categories of parables. Tonight we'll be talking about parables of the invitation of God, dealing specifically with the great banquet, the so-called wedding banquet or the king's banquet, the sheep, the gate, and the shepherd. We'll talk about the small parable from John of asking. I need to go up on volume. Sorry, I'm trying. We'll try that. Check, check, check. Any better? Maybe a little better? Okay. I'll try to wave again if I start lagging a little bit, because my voice will probably start lagging slightly. Let's bow in prayer, please. Our dear God, our Heavenly Father, we bow before you in wonder and amazement that you, the creator of this universe, have bowed down to this earth to give us your attention and your love, to give us a plan whereby we can be saved through the giving of your Son, Jesus. Please help us in studying his words tonight from your Gospels, that we can glean from these things the meanings and the truths that you intended for us to know, that we can incorporate them into ourselves and make them part of our very being as you would have us to do. For we want to have a relationship with you and become one with you, becoming like your Son. These things we ask in his name. Amen. So I'll mention that again. And my father-in-law, years ago, I've heard this many times, and you might have too. He was a great communicator and educator, and his principles of education were the 3 R's. And it wasn't reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was repetition, repetition, repetition. It doesn't matter what you're learning, whether you're memorizing scripture, whether you're trying to learn a new skill, whether you're trying to look at the steps of salvation to try to make disciples of people that you don't know, whatever it happens to be, repetition, repetition, repetition. So I'll repeat something. What's a parable? When we leave this class, I want you all to know exactly what a parable is. Earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Simply taking something we're familiar with and laying alongside it an illustration to let us know exactly what God means with these heavenly stories. And God is certainly a God of invitation. We've talked about the categories of parables of the kingdom, of forgiveness, of judging others. We've talked about humility and pride parables. We've talked about prayer principles, and we just finished the cost of discipleship. We'll spend several sessions on repentance coming up, and then the importance of individual preparation in our lives, both spiritually and physically. And then we're going to talk responsibility will be our last session, the importance of our personal and individual responsibilities. And then tonight we'll talk about this idea of the invitation of God. And I want you to think about the fact that when we're thinking about our God, Christianity is not a religion. I'll say it again. Christianity is not a religion. It's another R word. What is it? It's redemption. It's a relationship. That's what I was going for. It's not a religion. It's a relationship. So everything that we do encountering God is God bidding us in to become relationed with him, to have a relationship with him, for him to know us as he does, but for us to know him We want to know him in the same way that he knows us. That's an amazing concept. The unknowable God and us. But the thing that makes it possible, and the thing that makes it beautiful, and the thing that makes it awesome is that God is doing the inviting. So we'll look at some of these parables about the invitation of God. And we'll turn to Luke 14 for the first one, and that's the parable of the banquet, the great banquet. And beginning in verse 15 is where this starts for the parable. We'll talk about a little bit of context and back up, but go just a little bit back to verse 12. And we'll read this text. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." In verse 16, Jesus replied to him, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who'd been invited, 'Come, for everything now is ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first one said, 'I've just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another one said, 'I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another one said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry. The Greek word is furious. And ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there is still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and the country lanes so that my house, and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" So that's the story. Let's think about the context. We've already studied a little bit of the surrounding verses on this. Think about beginning of chapter 14. We've read this story before. What is the story that's taking place here? It's on a Sabbath day. He healed a man. We talked about that during the miracles, and it's specifically the man who had dropsy. What's dropsy? Repetition, repetition, repetition. It's also called lymphedema or edema. So if you see swelling in your ankles at night a little bit, you've been on your feet all day and you go, I'm a little swollen. That's edema. When it's really pronounced, like your legs look like the legs of an elephant, it's called lymphedema. So this was a man that was healed of this, and this was in the house of a prominent Pharisee. So that's the context. We find Jesus in the midst of a bunch of Pharisees in this house. And in this situation, he's there to eat, and this prominent Pharisee does not invite people of no repute. These are all people that are of repute. And it says he was being watched very carefully. So the Pharisees were monitoring Jesus' words and his actions. And this is the scenario we find ourselves in with this context. He's at the Pharisee's house for a meal, being carefully watched. He goes ahead and heals the man. You recall how he does that. They place the man right in front of him. Can't miss him. It's almost like, I think this is a attempted trap for Jesus. And Jesus approaches it by saying, Is it unlawful to heal on the Sabbath? He asked them that. And their response was, they weren't about to open that can of worms. They knew Jesus too well, that he was wise, understanding of the law, and I think they knew they were at fault in their decisions on this, but they were quiet. He healed a man on the Sabbath. He went ahead and healed him, but he gave a story. Remember the story? Which one of you would fail to help your ox if it fell into a ditch? That's a work. It's on the Sabbath. But he said, would you not immediately pull him out? And their response was, nothing. Okay? Very telling about the framework we're finding this audience, their mental state. They had nothing to say. And if you follow the story along, at that point in verse 7, he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table. They were all trying to get to the best spots. Now, this is of no great surprise, right? We've seen, I just saw last week, 2 weeks ago, a grouping that was getting together for a picture, and the people were kind of jostling to get in the middle of the picture, and then they were jostling to get to the front so they would be in the picture. And I saw one of them who was a shorter gentleman that was there on his tiptoes. So we're all trying to get that place of honor, okay? Natural, human nature. Jesus noticed this was happening and uses it as an opportunity to teach about the importance of humility. When he noticed the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place here. Then you'll be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. We've talked about this kingdom of being an upside-down kingdom. Constantly, Jesus talks about the last shall be first, the first shall be last, the most honored will be the least honored will be the most honored. The upside-down kingdom. Represented most distinctly in the fact that the king of this kingdom, the absolute ruler of this kingdom, is what? An humble servant who gives up his life to die on the cross. Not the kind of exalted royalty position that we think about in human terms, but in the upside-down kingdom, that's exactly what Christ's kingdom is. So he's just preaching this. He's telling this again. Don't seek after self-exaltation. Now, he mentions in verse 13, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. The response to this from one of these Pharisees in verse 15 is, when one of those at the table with him heard this, he said this reply. Think about what he's saying and maybe why he's saying it. Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. What is he saying to Jesus exactly? Okay? He could be saying that. What else might he be saying?
I wonder if it's sarcastic. In some ways, blessed is the ones that get invited there, leading into the next parable of, you were all invited. Yet you were too high and righteous, too busy to even come. It's really
Okay, so David says maybe it was a bit sarcastic in that, and if you think about the fact that he launches into this next parable, and he just finished this one statement. The one statement he finished was what? Welcome in. He mentions a bunch of undesirable people. People that in the Pharisees' mind, if someone's born with a lame foot, what does that mean to the Pharisee? Yes, it's a result of sin, and either his parents sinned or he sinned. Think about the blind man. Think about the lame man. Think about how many times that question was asked. Lord, who sinned, this man or his parents? Right? So Jesus says, invite the blind, the lame, the poor. And the Pharisees thinking, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't invite those people anywhere. And this crazy man with a demon, perhaps, is saying, So he references an Old Testament idea from Isaiah and Psalms. Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. His perspective is really totally different. Isaiah's prophecy of a new age where Jehovah would bless the who? The righteous with a banquet for all the earth. Not the poor, not the blind, not the lame, certainly. They're born into sin, steeped in sin, as the chief Pharisee had told the blind man. Isaiah 25 and verse 6, in Jerusalem the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food, it says, for the righteous. Surprise, surprise. To the Pharisees' ears, it says in Isaiah, that whole chapter there, a feast of rich food for all peoples. Something totally unheard of in their perspective, in their frame of reference. So two principles are being brought out here. First of all, in this passage in Isaiah, it says the Lord himself is the host. And then number two, it's not for the righteous, it's for the everybody. It's for all. All are being invited into the kingdom. The invitation is not exclusive. It's not a single thing you receive with an RSVP and your neighbor did not get it. Nope. All have been invited to this relationship that we're talking about.
Hey, John,
Yes.
when he talks about the righteous there, their thinking, as you said, is they're the righteous. But the point is that the lame, the blind, and all those can be righteous. And that makes it universal in itself again.
Yes.
And they weren't thinking that way. They were thinking that, righteous men, it only had to be the select few or chosen ones. But the righteous can be that lame person blind.
Exactly. I think you can hear Mark there. The righteous included and can be those other categories. To the Pharisees' mind, this is an exclusive club. You had to be born into it even. It wasn't a matter of saying completely a meritocracy. You had to be born into being a Jew as well for this to apply to you. And Jesus is turning that on its head and saying that's not the case at all. So the reply then comes immediately on the heels of this statement, which makes you think again, like David suggested, this is perhaps a sarcastic statement from the Pharisee or one in which he's saying, I don't like what I'm hearing. Blessed is the man who will receive the feast from the Lord, from Isaiah 25. But Jesus' reply to that is, as it oftentimes is, a parable. A certain man was preparing a great banquet, invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who'd been invited, come, for everything now is ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, I've just bought a field. I must go and see it. Please excuse me. Another one said, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen. I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. Another one said, I just got married, so I can't come. First point is, a certain man is preparing a great banquet. This is not just saying it's a big party. A great banquet is something which is really big. It's something like a grand person, a mayor would give, something a person of great importance would be giving to great people, to important people, to rich people. It's not just a party, a block party, but something in which you have an exclusive invitation. He invited many guests. And it says at this time, at the time is ready, he's inviting again all those who had been invited. An important point. They had been invited, saying, okay, it's now time. Come on. It's like the lights flashing in the auditorium, in the foyer just now. That was the invite saying, okay, everything's all ready. You've already been invited because you got your bulletin last week in the email, right? You know what time the Bible study is. Now the light's flashing. Time to come in. But they all began to make reasons for why they wouldn't be there. Doesn't say reasons, does it? What's the difference in a reason and an excuse? Well, let's evaluate their excuses a little bit here. If we're thinking about reasons, reasons typically mean what? Justifiable excuse, logical conclusion, acceptable. We would all recognize, oh yeah, you had COVID? Yeah, you're good. You leprosy? Yeah, you're good. A cold? No, you're not good. We all would accept those kinds of things. Excuses are when we go, we're all in agreement, that's not a justifiable reason. Let's look at these excuses they're giving here and think about that. First of all, who was the first excuse? I bought a field. I got to go check it out. Can you see any light shining through that excuse? It's still going to be there. And you've already bought it. How many of you have bought property sight unseen? I have. I'll just tell you, I have. But most sane people don't do that, right? And they didn't do it in the first century either. So if he says, I just bought a field, guess what? He'd already seen it and he'd walked through it. And so not much of an excuse there. What about the second one? I bought 5 yoke of oxen. I've got to go test them now. When's the last time you bought a car and you didn't test drive it? Raise your hand. You've bought a car with no test drive? Okay. I wouldn't have done that. Sorry, Paul, I wouldn't have done that. I know I know Daryl Tate has bought a car online in Florida. Hadn't test driven it, but he knew it pretty well before he went down there, before he did that. I know that. And that happens sometimes. But in general, if you're going to buy a vehicle here in Bowling Green, you're going to test drive it. And I can assure you, this fellow with the 5 oxen had known something about them before he bought them. So, flimsy excuse. Got married? That sounds a little more like a reason than an excuse. What do you think?
Well, there was some Old Testament thing where they had to be with the wife for a week or 2 weeks or something before they did anything else.
Yeah.
So that,
A wedding in the first century was not a, let's get married next weekend. Yeah, let's do that. No. It was something that a betrothal took place when you were a little early teenager, and then you got this long period of togetherness, and then you had a planned wedding, and then they planned a whole week around it, sometimes a month, depends on who you were. And you better believe that they knew about it at the time they received the invitation and could have said, should have said, we're getting married. But this was someone who had already been invited, accepted an invitation, and now they're saying, oh, I got married. So, in my book, that falls into an excuse as well. The master's response is, in this parable, again, that word is furious. He's furious. He ordered the invite to go out now to the outcasts, the people that Israel outcasted from themselves, the blind, the lame, the poor. And then a third invitation, when the hall was still not full, was to go out beyond our borders into the country roads. And the word that's used there, that word compel, literally says, and make them come in. Some of your translations, I think the New American Standard says, make them come in. That doesn't mean, hey, would you mind coming? that means I'm going to do everything I can to physically assist you out of your comfortable chair and come with me right now for this banquet. It's the concept of God running after us. That's what he's saying. Go out and invite everybody. Literally. Now, who is this talking about? In the parable, it's talking about the blind, the crippled, the lame, and the poor, but also the Gentiles. Yeah. Go out beyond our borders, he's saying, and invite them in too. Now, to the Pharisee, whoa, you stepped over the line. You stepped over the line. The Gentiles were a group of people that by no way, shape, or form was a Pharisee going to say, oh yeah, God's righteousness is for them as well. So the bottom line is, Luke 14:11, God calls all, but only the most humble respond. He's tying those two ideas into one common theme here. God calls all, but only the most humble respond. Now, if you look at I'll just point out one other thing here. Well, we'll do that later. Turn to Matthew 22 for the wedding banquet. We've got two banquets here. Some biblical scholars have said these stories are really similar. We think it's the same one. I think there's enough differences in these two stories, and chronologically they don't quite fit in as well in the narrative of Matthew and Luke. But if you look at these two stories, the context, let's back up a little bit on the context. If you look earlier in chapter 21 there, just before this occurs is when Jesus has entered Jerusalem. The triumphal entry at the beginning of chapter 21, on the Sunday before he's crucified. He spends a wonderful day in Jerusalem. Think about all that happened on that day with the palms being set down and a victorious entry into the city as the Messiah. He leaves Jerusalem, goes to Bethany as he did for those few nights and days. And the next day he's back in Jerusalem on Monday. And what happens on Monday? Things change right away. Partly because he has been in the temple. And what does he do in the temple? He cleanses the temple. He sees the marketplace environment. He sees the unholy situation with the temple. And he's furious, and he overturns the tables of the money changers, drives out those who are doing so with scourges. So now he's in front of the priests who hear his preaching in the temple and know what he did here. And they're saying, by what authority do you do this? We don't understand how you can be doing these activities and making these statements in the temple. His authority is questioned. By what authority are you doing these things? And this is the context for what happens here. If you look at just in front of chapter 22, look in verse 43. And I've got let's see. Okay, here it is. I'm sorry. In verse 23, if you recall the story here, he says, Jesus entered the temple courts and they said, how are you doing this? What authority? They asked. Who gave you this authority? Jesus' reply was, I'll ask you one question. What about the baptism of John? That they all knew about. This is not something done in a corner. It had overturned the world as well. By what authority did John's baptism come from? Was it from heaven or from men? And the story is they discussed it among them. They said, and they went back into a huddle, a Pharisee huddle. And I could just see him and hear him going, and they're thinking, we're stuck. If we say it's from God, that gives credibility to John. If we say it's from man, the people are going to riot because they're all John's disciples, basically. And so when they say, tell them we don't know. And that's what they did. They said, we don't know. They punted. And Jesus' response was, then neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. And then he launches into 3 parables. How many times does he do this? He finds a situation where a teaching moment is right there. And he could lambast them directly, but instead he gives a parabolic story to make something abundantly clear. It reminds you of Nathan. Thou art the man. It reminds you of so many times that we've seen it happen with Jesus. And here it is again, 3 parables in which he sticks it right back to the Pharisee leaders. The first one is the parable of the 2 sons, and then the parable of the tenants, the wicked tenants. In Matthew 21:45, it said, they knew, in that representation, the statement is, they knew he was talking about him at that point, after the second parable. And now this parable, the wedding banquet. So chapter 22, Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited. There's that phrase again. They had already been invited. Now he sends his servants out to tell them it's time to come. They didn't give excuses. They what? They just simply refused. They didn't simply refuse a man of high standing. They refused who? The king. Think about it. This is a man who has power of life and death over you. They refused him. They refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you can find. So the servants went out in the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, how did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend? The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, tie him hand and foot, throw him outside into the darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen. So, was this the same banquet? It has maybe some similarities, but not very many. Let's look at some differences here between the Luke account. It was called a banquet. The guests who make excuses are not attending because they've made excuses. A second invitation was given to the poor and handicapped, and finally a third invitation to everyone. In this account from Matthew 22, it was also a banquet, but it was specifically a wedding banquet. The king's son was becoming married. And we find that the guests are ungrateful, they're described as, and not worthy of coming, and refuse to attend. They don't make excuses, they just don't come. Second invitation to anyone willing, after the consequences of their cities being destroyed and burned and so forth. And then at the end of the story, an invited guest, not an uninvited guest, but an invited guest from the second round of invitations is found to be in street clothes. Now, we talked a moment ago about how first century weddings were a big deal, right? Lots of time spent. The whole town was involved typically. Surrounding towns sometimes came. They had, just like they had official mourners for funerals, they had official celebratory people for weddings. They had not just bands, but they had singers. They had people that were hired there just to rejoice and dance and keep the party going. It was a big thing. And here's someone that shows up in their flip-flops and gym shorts. What do you make about some of these things? We'll talk about the clothing part. I'll just mention now in case you run out of time. Is this an indictment for me not to come to services in flip-flops and gym shorts? It's in the Bible. He's thrown out, tied and thrown out because he's not wearing wedding clothes. Think about it. We're going to get to it. Takeaways. Number one, in both accounts, but especially here, there's only one way into the kingdom, and that is what? Through Jesus Christ and his invitation. He invites us. I stand at the door, and there's one way. Okay? Number two, a takeaway. God the King will judge those who deliberately ignore his invitation. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And this story, if I'm to believe Jesus' words, doesn't mean that God's going to stand by at the judgment and go, well, they weren't all bad. If we ignore the invitation, we'll receive the consequences, and they're not something small. God's army is destroying these people's entire town and killing the murderers, he says. Not a small thing. Here's again the theme of the reversal, turning the situation on its head. One more time. Here, the Jews were expecting to enjoy kingdom blessings in both stories, and that wasn't the case. Correct? Instead, they're replaced by those they actually despised. Not just the poor, the lame, the lame, but actually the Gentiles were invited as well, and they're replacing the Jews in this kingdom. What about the man without wedding garments? Let's talk about that a little bit more now that you've had a chance to ponder it. Now, we don't want to, as I've mentioned before, Jesus' parables have typically how many points? How many major points? Dan says one. Yes. The vast majority of the parables have one point that Jesus is trying to make. Sometimes there's a secondary point, and some scholars have said, we think there's a third point here too. I think we get dangerous a little bit when we start trying to make the entire story fit every single member of the story into some specific meaning behind it, because they don't always do that. But here, it's a pretty distinct comment by Jesus at the end about this man who was found without proper wedding garments. What do you think about that? No humility? Okay.
Not submissive to the king and his required banquet.
Not submissive to the king and the requirements of the banquet. Yeah. Okay. Okay. What if we're thinking? Dan mentioned these are spiritual garments. Okay, I want to. They're spiritual stories, exactly. These are earthly stories with a spiritual meaning. So we need to look at that context. When do we as Christians start talking about putting on garments? Absolutely. Look at Ephesians. Look at. There's so many different places in which we're told to put on Christ as if it's a raiment, as if it's a garment. And this makes perfectly good sense in thinking about this, that would be a situation where we have someone at the feast, at the wedding banquet, who's not clothed in the righteousness of Christ, who's not put on Christ. And we call that person who's acting like something but is not something what? A hypocrite. Yeah.
I think even if we just ignore the clothes part entirely, really simplify it, the invitation is free and open to all, but there's still an expectation from the person receiving it, which within this specific context is you're invited to a thing. You know what is to be expected to attend culturally. Like they understood what the expectation was. And so going back within the context, we can't just do whatever we want and then expect to take God up on his invitation. There is something that we can take from yes, it is free and it is open for all. But that doesn't mean we just show up.
Eden says we can't just show up, basically. Something is expected of us, even though, yes, we've received an invitation, it's free for all. However, we can't just show up. And in terms of taking on the righteousness of Christ, I think it means a lot. The gift is free. The gift is available to everybody, not just to the Pharisees, but to everyone. And yet, when you're thinking about the righteousness of Christ, to clothe ourselves in this, then we can't be having a two-faced situation and say, well, it's not important. I'll be who I want to be and not what God wants me to be. Floyd?
In every case, the one who prepared the banquet went to great pains to go all out and make this really elaborate. And it's very offensive, actually, the response he gets from those who are invited, just completely disregarding it. It's very offensive, and his indignation is justified. And then there's more than one way to disregard it. You can disregard it simply by not coming, or you can come and not be sincere, like a guy wearing wrong garments. But the same response is warranted in both cases.
So the response is either you're not coming, which would be ignoring it and not honoring the king, or you're not honoring the requirements of the banquet that's been offered. So, yeah, good. Okay?
Think about being a lukewarm Christian. The churches in Revelation talks about them being lukewarm, and not taking the seriousness of being a Christian to the right level. He's taking it very lax by not addressing it.
Okay. So a Laodicean kind of approach, you got to be hot or cold. You can't be lukewarm. And the decision to say, I'm going to be a Christian and be lukewarm about it is kind of like saying, I'm going to go to this banquet, but I'm not going to bother to dress up. I don't think. Nah, I won't. I will. No, I won't. Good, David.
I can't help but think the last few verses of chapter 21, where it says, when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking of them.
Yep.
Well, the chief priests and the Pharisees were the poster boys for hypocritical religious people. I think he's talking directly to them. They're the ones that are not supposed to be at the feast, improperly clothed, and they know better.
So Dan's comment was these chief priests and elders are the ones that it says at the end of chapter 21, and they knew that Jesus was talking about them. So the parable had done its deed and illustrated to them the way a parable is supposed to do. It had clearly shown them that they were in the wrong, and they knew it. But the response was not, beat our breast and say, what should we do? The response was they looked for a way to try to kill him. And after this last parable, at the end of chapter 22, they say, and then they sought for a way to arrest him. So they made plans to arrest him at that point. Thank you for your attention. We will be proceeding with the last 5 classes. We do have a review period. If there's something specific that you would like to talk about, some questions that haven't been answered this trimester for our last session, our 30th lesson, please get that to one of us, get it to me, and we'll see if we can get that discussed and covered. Thank you.